The last time I managed to blag my way onto a TED stage, I was talking about solving problems. I managed to stand there and say that everybody in that room was able to leave that conference with the power to solve any problem. And the way I defined that was that the power of perspective and the power of people was what you could combine and you could almost automate to solve problems and any problem. And so let's start. I'll tell you a little bit about me and why I can sort of stand here and say anything, really. Come on. So I started my engineering career when I was 10 years old. I was fascinated by Robot Wars. Does anybody remember Robot Wars? Yeah, geeks. So I started sort of just trying to challenge everything that I could see. You know, behind this TV show, there is actually more of an engineering competition, a real scientific thing where people with PhDs and suits and very expensive lab equipment get to play and be children. So why can't children pretend to be people with expensive lab equipment? I started using toys and just anything I could pick up and find to put together these robots and turn up to events. And I'd turn up hand in hand, both parents, flashing lights and my trainers, and everybody else is far, far older than me. So that was the challenge, and I spent most of my time there pushing everything that was going on. It didn't matter that they were already 30 years ahead of me. It was about pushing what was there on the table in front of me. So over the next few years, I learned how to design things. I broke Google's SketchUp program more times than they care to admit. And I started designing things that I couldn't actually produce anymore. I had this real issue that, as far as I could think, I couldn't actually deliver. And I started looking for factories. I could understand how to produce this stuff. I just didn't have it standing there in front of me as a tool within my reach. And so I started Googling for factories. As you do, that's how you find a factory. So I went around the UK with my parents trying to find some sort of machinist that would be happy to sit down and produce the drawings that I created for them. And that wasn't going to happen. It turns out that machinists are very, very skeptical. So I sort of spent some more time having a look at these things, and people started to say, well, you should go to China. Your pocket money won't go very far in this manufacturing economy. Go to China. Which I think was a joke, but when you Google Chinese factories, you can find them. And this was at a time, a few years back now, before the Chinese manufacturing economy understood kind of the internet and Google and how you could approach a Western business for their custom. And so I managed to find some people who were Western manufacturers who'd taken their businesses over to China and started to build almost little empires down in Shenzhen and southern China. And I started producing my components, so I would send them all of the files and things they needed to produce these things, and it was produced at the time of technology that was really quite limited to military and satellite use. I got lots of strange phone calls and lots of strange questions as to what exactly it was that I was building and how old exactly I really was. But that was fun, and I started to compete with these things, and I started to talk about them without really intending to talk about these things. I would write blog posts and just sort of keep a record of the things I was making and the things I was trying to achieve and goals, and see whether other people could input their ideas to these things. And that started to get picked up, and I was surrounded by engineers who were quite evolved in their sector, and so people started to ask me to do things. It would be, can you replace this part for my dishwasher? Can you make this part for my remote control car? And that slowly scaled out of all proportion. I started controlling supply chain for public companies when I was 16, 17 years old. Nobody thought to ask how old their supply chain consultant was. So I spent those few years kind of just playing. The reason that this was so interesting is because it was so real compared to what was being learned at school. And so I'd come home from my math lesson and I'd get onto Skype or my emails and start talking to somebody down in China and arranging a manufacturing shipment that would go out to the US, and then it would go via Brazil, and then it would be shipped through Geneva, and I'd spend all night on the phone with people all over the world. I was working in far too many time zones to count, and then I'd go back to school in the morning, and there was no reason I could see why this isn't possible. And so that kind of perspective taught me a lot about, we could solve problems. We can, engineer perspective like that. It doesn't take just a child to walk into an existing environment and see it differently and solve that problem. We could escalate that. We could build a machine around that, and so we did. I run a company called RPD International that is about making an engine for challenging that kind of conventional thinking, and so we bring in nutters from all over the world, nuclear submarine engineers, designers, artists, writers, psychologists, whatever we need, and put them on projects that they shouldn't work on. Because they're the people who can solve the problems, because they don't understand how things should work. And so this is an enormous amount of fun, but the biggest issue we have is actually making the problems we solve happen. You know, you pass on a solution to somebody, but that's a very, very small percentage of solving a problem. The largest chunk of solving a problem is execution. And I think the most hilarious example of this is a lot of the way that big corporations innovate. And so if I ask everybody here now to cross your arms, so about 40% of the people here bother, and that's all right, isn't it? Not really. Right, so if everybody puts their right hand up, and this time 80% of the people bother because there's some sort of threat that I'm going to embarrass you. And but what about crossing your arms? You forgot about that. And that's kind of how corporate innovation is working at the moment. That's the traditional way to innovate. Tell everybody what to do, scare them that they haven't done it, tell them what to do again, but we forgot about what we were talking about last week. Don't worry about that. And so it's wasted. And we've been, working really, really hard to find a way to make sure that every piece of work we do actually gets executed, and it gets executed well. And I found this story the other day that is just so inspiring. This is a story about a man called Jerry Sternan and a team from Save the Children who were tasked with solving malnutrition in Vietnam. That's a pretty tough challenge. In 6 months, which is insane, and it's ridiculous, but that's how big charities work. And so with this challenge, and you're not going to turn it down, so they went out there and they worked out what to do, and they started doing some just general analysis of what's going on. And they looked at certain villages, and they chose a small market to start with, and kind of analysed what is it that causes malnutrition. And we know what causes malnutrition, but is it correlated to wealth? Is it correlated to activity? Is it correlated to families and descendants? Is it inherited? And what they found is there's absolutely no correlation to wealth. The differences they were finding is that actually it was common knowledge that if you eat the shrimps and the crabs and the little shoots that you find in the paddy fields, that's not good. That's lower class behaviour. We can't have that. In families that are completely malnourished, that behaviour was still not acceptable. And so in finding that correlation between the families that were quite happy to go against that and feed their children with these more nutritious foods and more nutritious sources, they found that's the link that really was making a difference. And so the first thing they did is they said, okay, right, everybody, stop. I need you to eat crabs. Those lower class crabs you don't like, we need you to eat them. And naturally, nothing happened. The thing with human beings is when you tell a human being what to do, they don't want to do it. Even if it's for your own good, even if it's going to save your life, you do not want to do it as soon as I tell you how. So they started again. They moved on to the next village, a village that hadn't been told what to do, and they tried something different. They started setting up these little camps that effectively every few days all of the mothers would come together in a small group, and they would have to bring these lower class foods to the event. And the event would be a social calendar, a thing that people couldn't miss out on, and they talk about how to raise your children and things that are going on in the village, and it would be an important place to be. But while they were having that meeting, what they started doing is cooking with these foods and showing the women that this is good food, this is feeding you, you feel better, you can start feeding this to your families. And after 2 weeks the program would end, and the majority of those women would then go on to continue collecting those foods. They'd got used to collecting those foods and continue to cook them because they'd seen the benefit of it. And slowly what happened is they would then take over these groups, and they would slowly influence each village. And so when they left after the end of those 6 months, the villages that Save the Children had been in had reduced malnutrition by about 80%. And so when they came back to review that situation 2 years later, in children that hadn't even been born while they were there in that 6 months, malnutrition was still down by 80%. And Harvard went back a few years later, I think it's 10 years later they go back, and malnutrition almost across the entire country is down by 80%. Because it's the insider, it's the person who is your peer who has most influence on you. The thing that we are most scared of is each other. And this is, very interesting. This is a part of how you make things happen. But a secondary part of that is understanding why you need things to happen, and what is it that makes things happen. And so we had someone come to us the other day who was from a British supercar manufacturer. And they built this beautiful car, absolutely beautiful. They'd spent all of their money detailing this incredible engine, and it was just, absolutely stunning. They can't sell it. It's not because of the price. Price is fine compared to, peer cars. They can't work out what it is, but they think that if people could just see that engine, they'd buy it. So how do we make a glass bonnet on the front of a 200-mile-an-hour supercar? Expensive, dangerous. What are you really trying to solve? And so we worked back and worked out that, okay, so they want people to connect with this engine. They want people to really fall in love with where they've spent their money. But they can't do that because people don't open the bonnet of a car every day. Some people do, strange. So the real problem was this human connection, this emotion, that what connects us to our cars, what connects us to our luxury products is what we feel and what we touch and what we use to represent those. And in a car, that's car keys. And so very simply, every time you buy a new car or you have ownership of a nice car, you stand at the bar and you twiddle your keys like that and you make sure that everybody has seen what your keys look like. And so that's where we can innovate. And so we started looking at car keys and working out what other companies do. If you buy a £1 million supercar, you get the same car keys that you get on the family car from their sister company. That's insane. So we started working again on how do we design car keys based on jewelry? How do we take precious metals? How do we take things that feel nice in our hands and that really have the quality and the value of the car and the component that connects you most to that car emotionally? So it's a very simple solution, but it's understanding your customer, it's understanding who you're trying to approach that allows you to activate them. And this is something that we've come across several times now. And so with that information on how to activate a party, how to activate a group of people, and that information on understanding the person that you're trying to work with, you get this concept of selling to a champion. And selling to a champion is about aligning your product or your goals with the person you're trying to sell to understand the person you're trying to sell to. What do they want to achieve? And how do you align what you're offering them with that? And in that situation, you get somebody who you're trying to sell to, trying to sell your product harder than you are. And that is what we want to create. And so people come to us with user interface problems. They say, oh, well, we're a big software company. We need people to enter data because the more data we have, the more value our product has to the companies we sell it to. But we can't do that because it takes 30 fields to fill in that you get a sandwich for lunch. People don't want to do that. How do we reduce that friction? How do we take that out? It's not about reducing friction. These problems aren't about reducing technical challenges. They're about understanding who's using them. Something like that. The problem is motivation. And motivation is built up of resources, time and money, and it's built up of kind of social impacts. It's, am I scared that someone will look at me differently? Am I going to feel better about myself? Is there a risk of resource? Am I going to run out of money? Is someone going to take something away from me? Am I going to be in trouble? And so when you start aligning problems in that way and you start creating solutions that actually allow somebody else to achieve their goals in a better way, you can clearly escalate yourself by entering more data, or we'll automate the data entry by using connected products and wearable devices, or we'll simplify those interfaces. Can we reduce a 30-field box to an understanding of your environment and say yes or no? That's how you create interaction. You align with other people's resources. And so the key to making things happen is people. It's the same as solving problems. The key to making things happen is to understand the human being that you're working with and to work out how to activate them. Because people solve problems and people make things happen. So use humans. Thank you.